A wildfire. A stranger's scream. A single father who had every reason to keep running, and didn't. What Mason Reed discovered inside those flames wasn't just a woman who needed saving. It was a secret powerful enough to get them both killed. Drop a like and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The smoke had turned the afternoon sky the color of a bad bruise, deep purple, bleeding into orange at the edges. The kind of sky that didn't look real, that looked like something a painter had made up in a fever dream. Mason Reed had seen wildfires before. Grew up in the high desert country of Eastern California, spent summers as a teenager watching the mountains burn from a safe distance, while the adults talked in low, worried voices about wind direction and fuel moisture. He knew what fire sounded like when it was still manageable. A crackling, almost domestic sound, like a campfire scaled up. He also knew what it sounded like when it wasn't. This was the second kind. Alpine Canyon was roaring. He could feel the heat on the back of his neck even with the canyon wall behind him, even with 200 yards between him and the nearest wall of flame. The fire had jumped the ridgeline 40 minutes ago, faster than anyone had predicted, faster than the evacuation order had accounted for. He'd been doing a contractor survey on the eastern slope, just a routine job, measuring setbacks for a small residential project, the kind of work that paid the mortgage and kept Owen in soccer cleats, when the scanner on his truck had started screaming. He'd driven out fast, driven out smart. He was supposed to keep going. His truck was parked on the fire road another quarter-mile up the canyon, engine running, the way you do when you're not entirely sure the ground under you isn't going to turn into something you can't drive through. He had his phone in his hand. He had a text half-drafted to the woman who watched Owen after school on Tuesdays. Running late, fire jumped the ridge. I'm out, but might be a while. And he was focused. He was calm. He was doing exactly what a person with a 7-year-old at home should be doing when a wildfire loses its mind. And then he heard it. Not the fire. Underneath the fire. Under the roar and the creak of burning timber and the distant concussive sound of something structural giving way. A voice. A woman's voice, and it was coming from the wrong direction entirely. From the lower trail, the one that switchbacked down into the canyon interior, the one that was now, as far as Mason could tell, on the wrong side of the fire. He stopped walking. He stood on the fire road, and he told himself he had imagined it. The fire made sounds. Everyone knew that. It moved air in strange ways, created acoustics that didn't follow normal rules. It was possible, it was likely, that what he'd heard was a branch popping, or an animal, or some trick of the wind carrying a sound from the evacuation road above. He stood there for 4 seconds. Then he heard it again, and this time there was no question. It was a word. It was help, or something close enough to it that his body responded before his brain had finished processing. "God damn it," he said to nobody, and turned around. Boss. The lower trail dropped fast. He knew this section. He'd hiked it twice before, back when Owen was small enough to carry on his shoulders, and thought rocks were the greatest things ever invented. The trail cut down through a stand of Jeffrey pines, switchbacked across a dry creek bed, and opened into a narrow meadow about 1/3 of a mile in. In normal conditions, it was a nice walk. In normal conditions, the worst thing you might encounter was a rattlesnake sunning itself on a flat rock. The fire had crowned on the western slope and was pushing east. He was running west. The smoke was dense enough now that he'd pulled his shirt up over his nose and mouth, which didn't do much but felt better than nothing. His eyes were watering constantly. Every 20 seconds he stopped, oriented himself by the sound of the fire and the direction of the heat, and tried to figure out if he was getting closer or further from the voice. He was getting closer. "Hey!" he shouted. "Hey, I'm coming down the trail, can you hear me?" A pause. Then, "Here, I'm here. I can't move my leg. I'm behind the rocks near the creek bed." He found her exactly where she said she was. She was sitting with her back against a boulder the size of a refrigerator, her right leg extended in front of her at an angle that made his stomach drop when he saw it. The ankle was visibly wrong, swollen already, starting to purple even in the red-orange light. She was holding herself very still the way people do when they've learned that moving makes it worse. Her dark hair was loose and wild, full of ash and small debris, and she had a deep cut above her left eyebrow that had bled down the side of her face and dried there. Her eyes, when she looked up at him, were sharp and dark and completely alert, She was also, despite the ankle and the blood and the smoke, clearly furious. "I've been calling for 20 minutes," she said. "I heard you when I heard you." "Are you alone?" "Yeah." She looked past him, up the trail he'd come down, and something crossed her face that he couldn't read. Relief, but also something calculating, something that didn't quite belong on the face of a person who'd just been found by her rescuer. "You have to go," she said. "The fire's going to be at the meadow in 10 minutes, maybe less. You can still make it out if you go now." He crouched down and looked at her ankle. "That's broken." "I know it's broken. You can't walk on it." "I know I can't walk on it." She said it the way you say things to someone who is being irritatingly obvious. "That's why you need to go. I'll call again when it's safe. There'll be helicopters." "There are no helicopters," he said. "Wind's too high and visibility's too low. I heard it on the scanner." He looked at the fire. It was moving through the tree line at the top of the meadow now, and the sound it made was something between a freight train and something alive, something hungry. He could see individual trees torching, not burning slowly, but igniting top to bottom in a sudden column of white-hot light that lasted maybe 3 seconds before the tree was just a dark shape inside the fire. She followed his gaze. "Then you really need to go," she said, and her voice was steady, too steady. "There's no point in both of us." "Stop talking," he said. He wasn't being rude about it. He was already doing the math, already looking at the terrain, at the available cover, at where the fire was pushing and where the rock formations might break its run. "Can you put any weight on it at all?" "No." "I'm going to pick you up. It's going to hurt." "I know." "Tell me if I'm going to drop you." She looked at him properly for the first time, really looked at him, the kind of look that took in everything quickly and made a decision. "You won't drop me," she said, and it wasn't a compliment exactly, more like an assessment. "No," he agreed. "I won't." He got her up in 2 stages. She was a solidly built woman, not light, and he could feel the real actual weight of her when he got his arms under her, which was fine, which was exactly what he'd expected, but it recalibrated his sense of how fast he could move and what route made sense. She made a sound when her ankle shifted that she was clearly trying not to make, and then she made herself stop and got quiet. "Straight up the trail?" she asked, her mouth close to his ear. "No, the fire's faster than the trail. We need to go to the creek bed and follow it east to the road crossing." "That's longer." "The creek bed's cut 6 feet into the rock. It'll give us something to put between us and the flames." A pause. "Okay." "What's your name?" "Brielle. Brielle Hart." "Mason. Don't grab my neck too tight." "I wasn't—" "You were about to." She wasn't, but she adjusted her grip anyway. Mom. Getting to the creek bed took 11 minutes and felt like an hour. The smoke was thick enough that he was navigating mostly by memory and feel, keeping the heat off his left shoulder where he knew the fire was running, watching the ground for obstacles he couldn't quite see. Brielle was quiet and still in a way that he suspected cost her something. Her ankle was getting jostled with every step on the uneven ground, and he could feel the tension in her body each time she absorbed the pain without making a sound. Once, she said, "Left, there's a drop on your right." He'd already seen it, but thanks. The creek bed was dry, hadn't run in 4 months, typical for the canyon in summer, and the walls were exactly what he'd hoped, rough granite, almost vertical, close to 8 feet on either side. He dropped down into it and felt the ambient temperature shift immediately, just a few degrees, but enough. The smoke was still there, but the direct radiant heat was cut. He kept moving. "How far to the road crossing?" Brielle asked. "Quarter mile." "And your truck?" "On the road." "Keys in it?" "Engine's running." She didn't say anything for a moment, then quietly, "You left your truck running." "Yeah." "Because you thought you might have to leave fast." "That's generally why people leave trucks running." "And then you came back down into the canyon anyway." He didn't answer that one. There wasn't really a good answer that didn't sound either heroic or stupid, and he didn't feel like either. The creek bed bent east and then south, and when he came around the bend, he could see light. Actual white daylight, not fire orange, at the point where the bed met the road culvert. He moved faster. "Almost there," he said. "I know," she said. I can see it. He got her up through the culvert and onto the road, got her settled against the truck's passenger door, and opened it. Getting her into the seat was an exercise in patience and careful geometry, and by the time she was in, she'd gone pale under the ash and dried blood, breathing through her nose in short, controlled intervals. He drove. The road out was thick with smoke, and he took it faster than was smart, trusting the center line whenever he could see it, and his memory of the road layout when he couldn't. He passed 2 fire trucks going the other way, heard them on the scanner calling out the fire's position, heard the air attack coordinator say the wind was shifting north, which was good for the canyon and bad for the ridgeline above it. They cleared the smoke column at the canyon mouth, and the light changed suddenly to actual afternoon blue, and Mason pulled over on the wide gravel shoulder and stopped the truck and sat there for a second with both hands on the wheel. "You're shaking," Brielle said. "I know. That's adrenaline. I know what it is." She looked out at the canyon behind them, at the column of smoke that was now visible as a single enormous mass rising into the sky, going white at the top where it hit the cooler air. Her expression was complicated in a way he couldn't parse. "You have someone waiting for you," she said. Not a question. "My son. He's 7. She was quiet for a moment. "How old are you?" 32. "Why did you come back?" He looked over at her. She was watching him with those sharp, dark eyes, the cut on her head still ugly, her ankle propped against the dashboard because she'd figured out that elevation helped. She looked like someone who asked hard questions and waited out the silences until she got real answers. "I heard you," he said. "That's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." She held his gaze for another second, then looked away, back at the smoke. "My name is Brielle Hart," she said again, differently this time, as if reintroducing herself properly. "I'm the CEO of Hart Renewable Systems." "I know," he said. "I recognized you." That surprised her. "You did?" "You testified at the County Water Board hearing 8 months ago. I was there for a different reason. Permit issue on a job, but I remember. You weren't the kind of person you forget." He pulled the truck back onto the road. "I need to get you to a hospital." "I know." She reached into her jacket pocket, extracted a phone with a cracked screen, and looked at it. "I need to call someone first." "Call from the ER. Mason." She said his name like she'd already decided something. "Before we get there, there's something you need to understand. The fire back there." She stopped, started again. "It wasn't an accident." He kept driving. The road was straight here, running along the edge of the canyon toward the highway junction where the town of Ridgeline began its scatter of gas stations and fast food signs. The smoke column was visible in his mirror, huge and still growing. "What do you mean it wasn't an accident?" he said. She looked out the window. "I've been investigating a company called Meridian Land Group for the past 14 months. They've been acquiring canyon parcels through a series of shell companies, and the land titles they've been filing are fraudulent. Some of them are flagrantly fraudulent, forged survey documents, county records that were altered, names on deeds that correspond to people who've been dead for 15 years. She paused. "The evidence I'd gathered was cached on a drive in a fire safe at a property I lease in the Lower Canyon." Was, she agreed, along with paper documents and 2 months of field notes. "You think they burned it deliberately?" "I think the fire started in a location that made no meteorological sense given yesterday's wind patterns, and I think it started very close to that property." She looked at him. "I've been doing this long enough to know the difference between coincidence and intent." Mason didn't say anything. He was thinking about Owen, about the text he still hadn't sent, about the 7-year-old who was currently at after-school care waiting for a dad who'd had a slightly unusual Tuesday. He was thinking about how the day had been supposed to go. Survey the eastern slope, file the report, pick up Owen by 5, make pasta, and argue about vegetables and watch half an episode of something before bedtime. He was thinking about how different the day had actually gone. "I'm going to take you to the hospital," he said. "Your ankle needs x-rays and that cut needs stitches. After that, I need to pick up my son." "Of course." "After that," he said, "you can tell me everything." Brielle looked at him. "Why?" "Because you were going to die in that creek bed, and you didn't. And now you're telling me a wildfire was deliberately set to destroy evidence of a conspiracy worth God knows what. And I can't exactly just drop you off and go make pasta like I didn't hear that. She was quiet for a moment. Then, oddly, I'm not easy to work with. That's not really what I was offering. What are you offering? He thought about it. Help, he said. If it matters. She looked at him for a long time. He could feel it even with his eyes on the road. It matters, she said finally. It matters more than you know. Ridgeline Regional Medical Center was a modest place. 2 floors, a trauma bay that mostly handled hunting accidents and car wrecks, a staff who knew everyone by first name and took their coffee seriously. The ER nurse who met them at the door took one look at Brielle's ankle and Brielle's face and got her into a wheelchair with efficient, no-nonsense speed. Mason found a plastic chair in the waiting room and sat in it, and finally sent Owen Sitter the text. Then he sat there with the smell of smoke still in his clothes and the canyon still in his ears and tried to figure out what had just happened to his day. The ER was quiet at 4 in the afternoon. A teenage boy with a badly jammed finger, an elderly woman who might have had a TIA, a guy in work boots who dropped something on his foot. A TV on the wall was showing local news, and after 20 minutes, the crawler at the bottom of the screen said, Alpine Canyon Fire, 2,400 acres and growing. Multiple structures threatened. Cause under investigation. Cause under investigation. Mason watched it for a moment, then looked away. He called Owen Sitter, got confirmation Owen was fine and had eaten a snack and was currently destroying someone at a board game, and felt the knot in his chest loosen exactly one turn. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes and let himself be still for a minute. He thought about what Brielle had said. The fire wasn't an accident. If she was right, and something in the way she'd said it, something precise and without drama, made him think she was... Then someone had made a calculation. They'd looked at 14 months of her work, at whatever evidence she'd gathered, at whatever thread she'd been pulling on, and decided that burning it was easier than any alternative, which meant the thing she'd been investigating was big enough to justify arson on a scale that had now burned 2,000 acres and was still going. That was not a small thing. That was not the kind of thing you heard, and then went and made pasta. Brielle came out of the treatment area an hour and 15 minutes later in a hospital-issue wheelchair, her ankle wrapped and elevated, 4 stitches closing the cut above her eyebrow, looking exhausted and alert in equal measure. A young nurse was talking to her about follow-up care and the importance of staying off the ankle, and Brielle was nodding in a way that suggested she was hearing the words and filing them somewhere that was not her immediate priority list. She spotted Mason across the waiting room, and something in her face shifted. Not quite relief, but something adjacent to it, like she'd half expected him to be gone. He stood up. How bad? Clean break. They want me non-weight-bearing for 6 weeks. She said it the way you say something that is annoying, but not catastrophic. I have crutches in the car. Your car's in the canyon. I know where my car is. I can get you crutches from... I already asked the nurse. She nodded at a set of aluminum crutches propped against the wheelchair. They're lending me a pair. She looked at him. You stayed. I said I would. People say things. I know. He picked up the crutches and held them for her while she got herself upright, watching her figure out the mechanics of it with the focused, slightly impatient energy of someone who was going to master this as quickly as possible and resented needing to. Owen's fine. I'm going to pick him up in... He checked his watch. About 40 minutes. You should go. After I get you somewhere safe. He looked at her. Is your house an option? She was quiet for a moment. Probably not tonight. If they knew where the fire safe was, they know where I live. Hotel? For tonight. Okay, there's a place on the highway. Mason. She stopped moving and looked at him directly. She had a directness that he suspected she'd had her whole life, but not aggressive, just clear, unambiguous. The kind of eye contact that meant she was going to say something real. Why are you doing this? You pulled me out of a burning canyon. That's already more than anyone could ask. You don't have any obligation to... My son lost his mother 3 years ago, he said. She went quiet. Not the fire. Cancer. He was 4. He wasn't sure why he was saying it, except that it felt like it explained something that needed explaining. I know what it looks like when a person is in real trouble and they're trying to talk you out of helping them. She used to do that. Said she didn't want to be a burden. He shrugged, a small, tired movement. I don't love that argument. Brielle held his gaze. Something moved behind her eyes. Not pity, which he would have hated, but something closer to recognition. I'm not going to tell you this is safe, she said finally. I wasn't asking if it was safe. These people burned down a canyon. I know. To hide what they're doing. Whatever that is, and I know exactly what it is, they will do more. They have resources, and they have the will to use them, and they are not done. She said it clearly, making sure he understood, making sure there was no room for later surprises. I need you to know what you're potentially getting involved in. Mason thought about the fire roaring up the meadow. He thought about the sound she'd made when her ankle shifted and she'd made herself swallow it. He thought about Owen at 4 years old, learning that some things that were there in the morning weren't there in the evening. What exactly were they doing? He asked. The company, Meridian Land Group. What were they doing with the parcels? Brielle took a slow breath. Stealing the canyon, she said. One fraudulent deed at a time. He got her settled at the Ridgeline Inn, a mid-range chain place, anonymous enough, with a ground floor room, because the ankle made stairs impossible. She had her laptop, which she'd had in her backpack at the time of the fire. She had her phone. She had a portable hard drive that she extracted from an inner pocket of her jacket with the careful attention of someone handling something irreplaceable. You had that on you the whole time, he said. I always keep a copy. Even when you're doing survey work in a canyon? Especially then. She set it on the desk and looked at it. There are things on here that nobody else has. Records that were altered in the county system. I have the originals. Transaction records from 3 of the shell companies, 2 recorded conversations. She looked up at him. Not enough by itself, but combined with what was in the fire safe, which is gone. Which is gone, she agreed. So I need to go back in. He stared at her. The fire's still burning. Not in the lower sections. The wind shift moved it north this afternoon. The creek bed and the lower meadow. She turned her laptop toward him. She had a fire tracking map up, current, the perimeter drawn in red with timestamp overlays. That section will have burn crews on it by morning, but the fire safe itself should have protected the physical documents. She looked at him levelly. I know what I'm asking. I know it's a lot to ask. I'm picking up Owen in 22 minutes. I know. I need to be there. He's 7 and he had a regular Tuesday, and I'm not going to be the dad who isn't there because he's running around in a burned canyon. I wouldn't ask you to be. He looked at her, at the laptop open on the desk, at the hard drive beside it, at the stitches above her eyebrow, and the wrapped ankle elevated on a pillow because she'd already figured out the hotel's pillow-to-elevation ratio. She was already working. She had her phone out and was scrolling through something, and he could tell she was going to be working until she fell asleep in the chair. Tomorrow morning, he said. She looked up. I'll get Owen to school. I'll tell the school to keep him there. Normal day. No news if I can help it. And I'll come back here. He picked up his keys. And you're going to tell me everything, the whole thing, from the beginning. Brielle looked at him for a long moment. There's a man named Victor Caldwell, she said. He's the executive chairman of Meridian's parent company. He has county officials, at least 2 state-level contacts, and... She stopped. Tomorrow, she said. I'll tell you tomorrow. Why not now? The faintest thing crossed her face. Something that might have been, in a different person, the beginning of a smile. Because you have 19 minutes and Owen is waiting, she said. And I've already taken enough of your Tuesday. He went to the door, stopped with his hand on it. Lock this, he said. Obviously. And eat something. There's a diner 2 blocks west that delivers. She looked faintly surprised. How do you know that? I grew up in Ridgeline. He opened the door. The meatloaf is bad. Everything else is fine. He was in the parking lot before he heard the deadbolt engage. Owen was in the after-school room with 3 other kids and a 22-year-old named Danny, who was in her last year of an education degree and was, according to Owen, genuinely excellent at Uno. He had his backpack on and his shoes already tied when Mason came through the door, which meant he'd been waiting and was not entirely pleased about it. "You're late," Owen said. "I know, I'm sorry." "Danny said there was a fire." "There was." Mason crouched down to eye level. Owen had Claire's coloring, her dark hair, the freckle pattern across the bridge of his nose, and her habit of looking directly at things instead of sideways at them. "I had to help someone. I'm fine." Owen considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old who had learned earlier than most that "I'm fine" was a thing adults said and not always a true report. "What kind of someone?" he asked. "A woman who had a hurt ankle and couldn't get out on her own." "Did you carry her?" "Yeah." Owen thought about this. "Was she heavy?" "Owen, I'm just asking. She was a person. People have weight." He stood up and put his hand on Owen's shoulder. "You hungry? Danny gave us apple slices." "That's not food. That's a suggestion of food. Come on." Owen collected his backpack and his water bottle and the drawing he'd apparently been working on during the wait, which turned out to be, Mason saw when Owen proudly held it up, a fairly detailed rocket ship with what appeared to be a dog piloting it. "The dog is the captain," Owen explained. "Good call," Mason said. "Dogs are reliable." They went out to the truck. The sun was getting low, and the smoke column from the canyon was still visible to the south, turning the horizon colors that Owen pointed at and said were cool, which they were, in the way that destructive things sometimes were. They didn't talk about it again that night. Mason made pasta. Owen ate it without arguing about the vegetables, which was unusual enough that Mason felt briefly guilty about whatever expression had been on his face when he wasn't managing it. He read Owen 2 chapters of the book they were working through, something with dragons, and a girl who was better at magic than everyone expected. And when Owen was asleep, Mason sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and looked at nothing. He thought about the fire. He thought about Brielle Hart's voice, that first time he heard it, coming up through the smoke and the sound of burning trees like something that had decided it was going to be heard. He thought about Victor Caldwell, whose name he didn't know yet, whose face he'd never seen. He thought about the canyon and what it meant to burn a canyon to hide what you'd done there. Then he got up, washed the glass, checked the locks, and went to bed. He didn't sleep well, but he slept. Tomorrow was going to be a longer day than today had been, and today had been the longest day he'd had in 3 years. He was already sure of that. He was at the Ridgeline Inn by 7:45 the next morning. Owen dropped at school with a lunchbox and a reminder to stay for aftercare if Mason was late. The parking lot was mostly empty. The smoke column to the south had thinned overnight. Still there, still visible, but grayer and more diffuse, the fire settling into the slower burn of mop-up rather than the explosive run it had been doing the day before. He knocked twice and heard the sound of crutches on carpet before Brielle opened the door. She hadn't slept much. He could tell without asking. The particular flatness behind the eyes, the way a person holds their shoulders when they've been awake and working for hours and are pretending they're fine. She was dressed, her hair pulled back, the laptop open on the desk behind her with 3 browser tabs visible from the doorway. The stitches above her eyebrow had darkened overnight into something that looked worse than it probably was. "Coffee?" she said. "Please." She'd already ordered a second cup, which meant she'd expected him. He pulled the desk chair around to face the laptop, and she settled onto the bed with her ankle elevated, and her own cup, and the kind of silence that meant she was about to say something she'd been organizing since before sunrise. "Victor Caldwell," she said. 61. Executive Chairman of Callaway Group Holdings. They're the parent company behind Meridian Land Group, which is the entity doing the actual acquisitions. She turned the laptop toward him. A man's face on the screen. A press photo, well lit, the kind of shot taken at a charity gala or corporate event. He looked like someone's grandfather, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the particular confidence of a man who had never once in his adult life worried about how he was going to pay for something. He's been acquiring land in Alpine Canyon and the surrounding watershed for 11 years. The early acquisitions were clean, or clean enough that I couldn't find the seams. The more recent ones aren't. How recent? The fraud started in earnest about 4 years ago. She pulled the laptop back and scrolled. The County Land Records Office updated their digital archive system 3 years ago. Before the update, records were cross-referenced manually. Slow, imperfect, easy to manipulate if you had the right person in the right position. After the update, everything is linked. So if you forge a deed now, it creates inconsistencies in the chain of title that are visible if you know what to look for. And you knew what to look for. I spent 4 years as an environmental compliance attorney before I started Hart Renewable. She said it matter-of-factly, not like a credential, but like context. I read land records the way other people read the news. I know when something's been altered. She pulled up a document on the screen, a dense, column-heavy page that looked like a county filing. This parcel, Lot 14C in the Lower Canyon, according to the county's current records, it was purchased in 2019 by a company called Highline Basin Properties. Highline Basin is a shell, registered in Delaware, no physical address, officers listed as 2 names that correspond to people who don't exist. But the deed itself references a 2014 title transfer from a man named Gerald Foss. She looked at him. Gerald Foss died in 2011. Mason looked at the screen. And nobody caught it? One person in the records office almost did. She flagged an inconsistency in the survey description. The legal boundaries didn't match the field markers. She was transferred to a different department within a month. Brielle's voice was level, but he could hear the thing underneath it. The long, accumulated frustration of someone who had been watching wrongdoing happen in slow motion and couldn't get anyone to see what she saw. I found 19 parcels with similar problems. 19. Total assessed value of the legitimate land plus whatever they're planning to build on it. We're talking somewhere between $60 and $90 million. What are they planning to build? She set her coffee cup down. That's the part that took me a year to figure out, and it's the part that's going to make people very angry when it comes out. She stood on her good foot, crutched her way to the desk, and pulled up a different file. Something that looked like an architectural rendering, a site plan overlaid on a topographic map. He recognized the canyon topography immediately. Resort development, a private club, 1,400 acres of restricted access, a private airstrip, high-end residential, and hospitality. The kind of thing that gets built in places that were previously wildland, and once it's built, you can't unbuild it. Okay, that's bad, but that's development. That happens. Not on land that was fraudulently acquired using forged documents and a dead man's name. She looked at him steadily. And not on land that includes a protected watershed that feeds 3 municipalities. And not when the environmental impact assessments that were filed with the state were falsified by a consulting firm that Callaway Group owns through another shell company. She paused. And not when 2 of the county commissioners who approved the preliminary project plan received significant payments through what appear to be fraudulent consulting agreements with a third Callaway subsidiary. The room was quiet. Outside, a delivery truck was running through the parking lot, and somewhere down the corridor a door closed. Fraud, bribery, environmental falsification, money laundering, Mason said. At minimum. And the fire. And the fire. She turned away from the laptop and looked out the window at the smoky southern sky. I'd been careful. I thought I'd been careful. But someone knew I had a lease property in the canyon, and someone knew I was using it to store documents. She turned back, which means someone has been watching me for a while. He sat with that for a moment. Have you contacted anyone? Law enforcement, state level? I contacted the county sheriff's office 4 months ago with preliminary findings. I was told the matter would be reviewed. She produced a brief, humorless expression. I followed up 3 times. The last time I followed up, I was told the case had been assigned to an investigator and I would be contacted when there was progress. She spread her hands slightly. I've heard nothing, and one of the names in my bribery documentation is a close personal friend of the county sheriff. State level? I have a contact in the state AG's office. She's been helpful. Genuinely, I think she wants to do something with it, but she needs more than I've given her so far. The shell company documentation is circumstantial without the underlying transaction records, and the transaction records were in the fire safe. Mason stood up. He walked to the window and stood there, looking at the smoke. Then he said, "Can we get to the property today?" Brielle was already looking at the fire tracking map. The lower meadow section has been released from the active fire zone as of 6 this morning. There'll be mop-up crews in the upper canyon, but the lower trail should be accessible. She paused. My car is still on the lower fire road, assuming it didn't burn. What kind of car? Black Subaru Outback. Probably fine. That section didn't torch. He turned around. Can you manage the terrain on crutches? No, but I can manage it on one leg and your arm. That's not... Mason. She looked at him with that flat, patient expression that he was beginning to recognize as the face she used when she was not going to argue about something. I know where the fire safe is. I know what's in it. I know how to open it. I'm going. He looked at her for a moment, then, the ankle brace they gave you is not enough for that terrain. I need to stop at the hardware store on the way out. For what? Ankle support tape. And you need boots, not those. He nodded at her hiking shoes, which were one step below what the terrain was going to demand. What size? 8.5. My neighbor's wife left a pair of boots in my truck last winter. I think they're 9s, but they'll be close enough with the tape. He picked up his keys. Give me 40 minutes. I'll come back. We'll go. She watched him move toward the door. You're surprisingly practical, she said. He glanced back. You expected impractical? I didn't know what to expect. She said it honestly. You're a contractor who carried a stranger out of a wildfire and showed up the next morning to hear about financial fraud. That's not a standard person. I'm a pretty standard person, he said. You're not, she said, and she wasn't flattering him. She said it like a neutral observation about a fact. He left before he could think of an answer to that. The lower canyon smelled like the inside of a fireplace that had been running for a week. The burn pattern was strange, the way wildfire burn patterns always were. One side of a trail scorched to the root, the other side barely touched, the fire having made decisions based on wind shifts and fuel moisture and terrain that nobody had been there to observe. The Jeffrey pines that had torched the day before were standing columns of black, some of them still smoking faintly at the base. The ground was gray-white in the burn areas, that particular ash that was lighter and finer than it looked, that rose in small clouds around your feet when you walked through it. Mason had parked on the fire road and they'd found Brielle's Subaru unburned and intact, which she acknowledged with a single nod of relief and nothing else. She had her good leg doing the work and her right arm looped through his, and they moved slowly, which was the only option. He'd wrapped her ankle with the sports tape before they'd left the hotel, tighter than the hospital wrap, layered, the way he'd learned from the physical therapist Owen had seen after a bad fall 2 years ago. And she said it helped. He believed her because she was walking without wincing at every step, which he would not have predicted. The property was a small structure, barely more than a cabin. A lease she'd taken 3 years ago, she'd told him on the drive, specifically because of its remoteness. The fire had taken the wooden structures. The roof was gone. The walls had burned down to their framing in most places. But the fire safe, a 200-pound steel cabinet that she'd had installed into a concrete-floored closet in the northwest corner, was standing in the ruins exactly where she'd said it would be, and it was, externally at least, intact. She knelt on her good knee beside it and worked the combination with the careful, deliberate movements of someone who was making herself go slowly on purpose. The dial was warped enough from the heat that the third number required real force, and she made a low, frustrated sound in the back of her throat. "Let me," he said. "I've got it." "Brielle, I said I've got it." She applied more pressure, felt the tumbler's catch, and pulled the handle. The door opened. A smell came out. Scorched rubber, hot metal, the particular dry heat of a contained space that had absorbed enormous ambient temperature without losing its contents. The folders inside were intact, some of their edges heat-darkened, but the documents themselves readable. She exhaled once, slowly, and then she started pulling files. He watched her sort them, quickly, efficiently, her eyes moving over each document before she set it in the stack she was keeping or placed it back in the safe, with the decisiveness of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. She had a cloth shopping bag they'd brought for this, and she filled it methodically. "There," she said, when the bag was full and the safe was empty. She sat back on her heels and looked at the bag for a moment with an expression he couldn't quite name, something between relief and anger. "Good?" he said. "Good." She let him help her back to standing. "Now I have enough." He handed her the crutches. "Enough for the AG contact." Enough for the AG contact, and enough for something else I've been thinking about. She took a slow look around the ruins of the property, the collapsed walls, the ash, the burned-out frame of a table she'd apparently worked at for 2 years of evenings. Something moved across her face. Not sentimentality, exactly. More like a final accounting. There's a journalist. His name is Evan Cross. He covers environmental crime and corporate fraud for a national outlet. He broke the Hartley Basin story 2 years ago, if you followed that. I didn't. It was a big deal in the environmental space. He's credible, he's careful, and he doesn't run something until it's bulletproof. She started back toward the trail, moving slowly but steadily. I've been in contact with him for 6 months. He knows the outline of the story. He doesn't have documents yet. You're going to give him what's in the bag. I'm going to give him copies of what's in the bag, along with everything on the drive. He and I have been building this for long enough that I trust his process. She navigated a section of ash-covered ground, testing each step before committing. But I need you to understand something. Once Evan publishes, and if he has this documentation, he will publish, Caldwell is going to know it came from me. He already suspects. The fire was his first move. There will be others. I know. You don't owe me anything, Mason. You got me out of the canyon. That was more than enough. You said that yesterday. I'm saying it again. He held a section of burned brush aside so she could pass. I heard you the first time, he said. I'm still here. She didn't respond, but she didn't argue either, and he was starting to understand that for Brielle Hart, that was its own kind of answer. The men in the gray sedan were parked on the highway overlook when they came up the fire road, and Mason noticed them before he'd fully registered why. A gray Dodge Charger in a pullout that wasn't much of a pullout, engine running, positioned with a sight line directly down the access road. 2 men, early to mid-40s, wearing the kind of plainclothes that were trying hard not to look coordinated. He didn't say anything. He drove past them at a normal speed, watching his mirror. The Charger pulled out 200 yards behind them. We've got a car following us, he said. Brielle didn't turn around. Gray sedan? Yeah. How long? Just picked them up at the overlook. He kept his speed even. They were waiting. They knew we'd come back out that road. How many? 2. She was quiet for a moment. She had the shopping bag on her lap and the portable hard drive in her jacket pocket, and she was thinking. He could see it. The slight change in her expression, the way she went inward briefly. Head toward town, she said. Main Street, not the highway. Parking lot of the public library if they have one. Why the library? Because there will be a parking attendant and a county security camera on the building, and because I'm going to make a phone call, and I want them to see me making it in a public place. She paused. They're not going to do anything stupid in front of a security camera. He turned onto Main. The gray Charger followed, keeping a conservative distance. Who are you calling? Evan Cross, and then my lawyer. He pulled into the library lot. The Charger slowed, past the library entrance, and parked on the street where it had a view of the lot. Close enough to watch, far enough to be ambiguous. Brielle made the calls. The one to Evan Cross lasted 11 minutes, and Mason heard enough of it to understand that Evan Cross had been waiting for this call for a while, that he had 4 questions ready before she'd finished her second sentence, and that she answered each of them with the precise brevity of someone who'd rehearsed the condensed version. The call to her lawyer was shorter. She read off the plate number of the Charger at the end of it. When she hung up, she sat for a moment looking at the phone. Evan wants to meet, she said. In person. He'll come to us. When? He can be here day after tomorrow. She glanced toward the gray car on the street. We need to move the documents somewhere secure before then. Somewhere that isn't the hotel. I know a place, Mason said. She looked at him. My house, he said. Nobody knows you're connected to me. They followed us from the canyon, which means they were watching the canyon. They don't necessarily know whose truck they followed. He kept his eyes on the Charger. If you're seen going into my house, you're visiting the contractor who happened to pull you out of a fire. That's not suspicious. People visit their rescuers. Brielle thought about it. Owen is there in the evenings. I know. I don't want him near this. Neither do I. He said it quietly. Which is why I'm not going to let it get to that point. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her jacket, produced the hard drive, and held it out to him. "Keep this separate from the documents," she said. "If something happens, if we get separated, the drive has everything that matters." He took it. It was smaller than he expected, palm-sized, slightly warm from her body heat. "Nothing's going to happen." "Mason." "I know." He put the drive in his breast pocket. "I know." The Charger sat on the street. Neither man got out. They sat in the library lot for another 20 minutes, and Mason watched a mother push a stroller through the library doors and a teenager lock up a bicycle and a retired man in a Cardinals hat feed bread to the pigeons near the fountain. And the ordinary Tuesday afternoon quality of it felt slightly surreal against the weight of what was in his pocket, and the gray car on the street, and Brielle beside him calculating threats with the particular focus of someone who had decided, somewhere along the line, that she was not going to be afraid. "You're not scared," he said. "I'm scared," she said immediately. "I just don't think being scared is useful right now." "What is useful?" She looked at the library doors. "Moving forward," she said. "It's the only direction that doesn't get you burned." He started the truck. The Charger followed them out of the lot, maintained its distance all the way to the edge of town, and then, at the junction where the highway split toward Ridgeline's residential neighborhoods, it turned off and disappeared. He watched his mirror for 2 miles before he was sure it was gone. Neither of them said anything about what it meant that they'd stopped following. Both of them knew. Being watched from a distance was one thing. What came after the watching was something else entirely, and there was nothing to do about it yet except keep moving. Mason drove home. The drive in his breast pocket felt heavier than it weighed. Evan Cross arrived on a Thursday morning in a rental car that had a dent in the rear quarter panel and a coffee cup in the holder that was clearly not from that morning. He was 38, lean in the way of someone who forgot to eat when he was working, with dark circles under his eyes that suggested the drive from the airport had followed a red eye that had followed another late night. He shook Mason's hand at the door with a grip that was firm but distracted, the grip of a man whose mind was already 3 steps inside the house. He looked at Brielle's stitches and her ankle and the way she was standing and said, "You look worse than you sounded." "You look exactly as bad as you always do," she said. "Fair." He came inside and put his bag on Mason's kitchen table without asking and pulled out a laptop and a legal pad covered in handwriting that moved in 3 different directions. "Walk me through the chain of title on the Foss parcel first. I want to nail that one down before we touch anything else." They worked through the morning and into the afternoon. Mason made coffee and stayed largely quiet, following the documentation as Brielle and Evan moved through it. The forged deeds, the shell company registrations, the falsified environmental assessments, the payment records that traced back to the 2 county commissioners. He was not a lawyer and he was not a journalist, but he was good at following a logical sequence, and at some point 2 hours in he understood the full shape of what Brielle had built, and it was substantial. Not just the land fraud. The fraud was the foundation, but what Caldwell had been constructing on top of it was larger. A private development that would have consumed watershed land serving 3 counties, pushed through on falsified environmental clearance, approved by officials who'd been paid to approve it, and protected by a paper maze of shell entities designed to make the accountability impossible to trace. The fire had been the moment the maze started to feel threatened, and burning the canyon had been Caldwell's instinct. If the evidence is the problem, eliminate the evidence. He hadn't counted on the fire safe. He hadn't counted on the copy drive. And he hadn't counted on Brielle Hart's habit of making redundant backups of things she considered irreplaceable. "The shell company documentation is solid," Evan said, midway through the afternoon. He had 3 separate stacks of documents in front of him, and had been annotating them with a red pen in a handwriting so small Mason had stopped trying to read it. "The Foss deed forgery is solid. The payment records for Commissioner Holt and Commissioner Deering, I want a second set of eyes on those before I publish, but they look solid." He looked at Brielle. "The environmental falsification is solid. What I don't have is the direct line from Caldwell to the fire." "No," Brielle said. "I have his name on Meridian's parent documents and on 2 of the shell company officer filings. I have his personal email on a forwarded chain that references clearing the canyon problem. I don't have someone who will say on record that Victor Caldwell ordered a wildfire." The email chain is suggestive but not definitive. A good defense attorney gets it excluded or contextualized into meaninglessness. Evan tapped his pen on the legal pad. The state AG's office. Your contact there. She's been helpful. She's not going to go on record before publication. After? After, yes. She'll open a formal investigation once the story is out. Brielle shifted her ankle, resettled it on the pillow Mason had brought without being asked. The publication is what opens the door. Once it's public, the political cost of non-action becomes higher than the cost of acting. Evan looked at his laptop screen. I can have this ready in 10 days, maybe 8 if I push. He glanced over at Mason. You're the person who got her out of the canyon. Yeah. You're willing to be named? Mason looked at Brielle, then back at Evan. If it's relevant. It establishes the timeline. You're a witness to the fire's origin point and to her condition when you found her, which speaks to the severity of what they were willing to do to suppress this. He held Mason's gaze. Your name in the story also makes you a documented person in this, which provides a degree of protection, or makes me a target. There is that, Evan said, without pretending otherwise. But unnamed sources are easier to dismiss. And the people who know you're involved already know. That car that followed you from the canyon wasn't coincidental. Mason thought about Owen at school, eating whatever constituted lunch on a Thursday, completely unaware that his father was sitting at the kitchen table with a journalist and a CEO and a shopping bag full of documents that someone had set a wildfire to destroy. He thought about the drive in his breast pocket, which he'd been carrying since the library parking lot, like something he was afraid to put down. Name me, he said. 3 days after Evan drove back to the airport, Brielle's apartment was broken into. She wasn't there. She was at Mason's house, working from the kitchen table, which had become an informal base of operations over the previous week in a way that neither of them had formally agreed to, but that had happened anyway. She was on the phone with her operations director when her building manager called to tell her that her door had been forced and her unit had been searched. She hung up with her operations director, called her building manager back, then sat very still for a moment. Someone hit my apartment, she said. Mason set down the coffee he'd been carrying to her. When? Sometime in the last 4 hours. She was doing the arithmetic, what had been there, what they would have found, what it meant. My desktop computer, my personal filing cabinet. There are documents there, but nothing that adds to what they already don't have. She looked at her hands, then up at him. They're looking for the drive. The drive is here. I know. She picked up her phone again. I need to call the police. Your local department is, I know who they're connected to. I'm going to call the state police non-emergency line and file a formal report that creates a paper record. She said it with the efficiency of someone who had thought about this contingency and had a process ready. It won't produce an investigation, but it creates documentation that I reported a break-in, which I need for later. She made the call, gave her address and a crisp, factual account of what had happened and what she believed was missing, stayed on the line long enough to get a case number, hung up. Then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. She set the phone on the table and looked out the window at the oak tree in Mason's backyard, the one Owen had been trying to convince him to put a tire swing on since approximately the day they'd moved in, and she stayed like that for almost 30 seconds without moving. You all right? Mason said. They went through my home, she said, and her voice was very flat and very controlled in a way that told him the flatness was doing a lot of work. I've been prepared for this for months, logically. I knew it was a possibility. I had contingencies. She paused. It's still different when it actually happens. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything about how it would be okay, because he didn't know if it would be, and she was not the kind of person who was helped by that kind of statement. The documents are secure, he said. Evan has his copies. The drive is here. The story publishes in 6 days. She looked at him. They're going to come here, she said. Eventually, when they don't find it anywhere else. Maybe. I don't want Owen. Owen is not going to be in harm's way, he said. And he said it with a steadiness that came from somewhere below his thinking, from some part of him that had decided this already and was not interested in revisiting it. I've already talked to my sister in Pasadena. If things escalate, he goes there. She thinks it's a visit. Owen thinks it's an adventure. Brielle looked at him. When did you arrange that? Day after the car followed us from the canyon. She was quiet. Then, you think ahead. I have a 7-year-old. Thinking ahead is the job. She looked out the window again. The oak tree was moving slightly in the afternoon breeze, its shadow slow and shifting on the dry grass below it. Tell me something that has nothing to do with this, she said. He looked at her sideways. I mean it, she said. Just for a minute. Tell me something else. He thought about it. Owen wants a tire swing. I keep telling him the branch isn't the right shape. He keeps telling me I'm wrong. Is he wrong? Mason looked at the oak. No, he admitted. He's probably right. The branch is fine. Then why haven't you put the tire swing up? He was quiet for a moment. Because that was something Claire and I were going to do together. Build a swing set, the whole thing. She had a whole design for it, cut out of a catalog. We were going to do it when Owen was 4, and then she got sick and we didn't. He said it evenly. The tire swing feels like the smaller version of that. Like I'm doing it wrong, doing it without her. Brielle didn't say she was sorry. He appreciated that more than he could have explained. She just sat with it for a second, then said, What was she like? Funny, he said. Funnier than me, which isn't hard. She laughed at stupid things, bad puns, slapstick. She was a structural engineer, and she used to draw stress diagrams on napkins when she was explaining things and make you feel like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. He paused. She would have liked you. Brielle looked at him. Something moved across her face that she let happen and then let pass. Why? Because she had no patience for people who backed down from things that mattered. He picked up his coffee. Neither do you. The story ran on a Tuesday. Front page of the digital platform, flagged as an investigative special, with Evan Cross's byline and a deck that read, Shell companies, forged deeds, a corrupt land scheme worth tens of millions, and a wildfire that wasn't an accident. It included the document evidence, the Shell company chain, the payment records, the email with the phrase clearing the canyon problem, Mason's account as a named witness, and Brielle's full account of 14 months of investigation. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. By evening, it was being cited in 3 national outlets. By the following morning, the state AG's office had announced a formal investigation. Mason heard all of this secondhand because by Tuesday afternoon he was dealing with a different problem. Owen hadn't come out of school at pickup time. He'd stood by the gate where the 3rd graders were released at 3:15, watching the stream of kids come through, watching it thin, watching the last few stragglers, and Owen was not among them. He'd gone inside. The teacher said she'd seen Owen in class until 2:45, when he'd gone to the bathroom and hadn't come back. The bathroom was empty. His backpack was on his hook in the classroom. Mason called Owen's name through the school's rear yard before he'd consciously decided to do it, heard nothing, called the school office, got the principal on the line, watched the principal's face go from reassuring to something else. Owen was not on school grounds. He called Brielle from the parking lot. He was aware that his hands were shaking, and he was aware that he needed to stop them, because shaking wasn't going to find his son. And he pressed one palm flat against the roof of his truck and said, Owen's gone from school. I don't think he left on his own. There was a half-second pause, the kind that meant she'd heard him and was processing the full implication. Then, I'm calling Evan, and a man named Ray Pacheco. He's a former military specialist I've worked with before. I've been in contact with him since the apartment break-in. Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. Mason, listen to me. Don't call the county sheriff's office. I know. He did know. He'd known before she said it. State police? Yes, right now. File the report and tell them you believe it's connected to the Caldwell investigation. Use that word, Caldwell. It's public now. Use it. He hung up and called the state police. He gave his name, his address, Owen's description, 4'2", dark hair, red zip-up hoodie, 7 years old, and then he said Victor Caldwell and watched 2 nearby teachers look at him with the particular expression of people who'd just that morning read something about a Victor Caldwell and were recalibrating what kind of problem this was. He drove home because there was nowhere else to go and because Brielle was there, and because standing in a school parking lot was not the same as doing something. Brielle was on the front step when he pulled in, phone in hand, jaw set. Behind her, through the front window, he could see a man he didn't recognize sitting at his kitchen table, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 50s, gray at his temples, and very still in the way of someone who had learned stillness as a professional skill. "Ray Pacheco," Brielle said before Mason had finished getting out of the truck. "He drove from San Bernardino. He's already on it." "On what? On what?" "We don't know." "Mason." She put her hand on his arm. It was the first time she'd touched him that wasn't logistical, wasn't about navigating terrain or passing a document across a table, and the weight of it was different. "We know it's connected. We know who has him, and Ray can find things that the police can find, but faster." He looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Then he went inside. Ray Pacheco shook his hand with the economy of a man who didn't waste gestures. "Former MARSOC," he said, which Mason understood to mean Marine Corps Special Operations. "I've worked private security and investigative work for 6 years. Brielle brought me in as a precaution 4 days ago. I've been building a profile on Caldwell's associates and their operational patterns." He had a tablet on the table with a map open on it. "There are 3 properties with confirmed Callaway Group connection within 40 miles of here. 2 are commercial. 1 is a warehouse facility they lease through a subsidiary, Highline Basin, the same shell entity from the land records." "The warehouse," Brielle said. "It's the only one with privacy capacity for what they're doing." Ray touched the map. "I can have eyes on it in 90 minutes. "Do it," Mason said. "There's one more thing first." Ray looked at him directly. "There's a contact method. They'll use one. Either a call to you or to Brielle or, given that the story published today, something more public. When they make contact, do not agree to anything. Do not refuse anything. Buy time." He held Mason's gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes." The call came 40 minutes later. Unknown number, straight to voicemail when Mason didn't answer, which was Ray's instruction. The voice on the voicemail was male, neutral, carefully unaccented, the voice of someone who'd learned to speak without characteristics. "Mr. Reed, your son is safe and will remain so, Ms. Hart needs to make a public statement retracting the accusations published this morning and confirm that the documents supporting those accusations have been destroyed. You have 24 hours. Attempting to involve law enforcement will complicate the situation. We'll be in touch." Mason listened to it 3 times. He was sitting at the kitchen table with Brielle across from him and Ray at the counter, and after the 3rd time, he set the phone down on the table very carefully. His hands had stopped shaking. He noticed that. Fear at a certain depth stopped producing shakes and started producing something colder. 24 hours, he said. "We don't need 24 hours, Ray said. He was looking at the tablet. "I've already got a contact confirming vehicle movement near the Highline Basin warehouse in the last 2 hours. A van, late model, matching the plate format of a Callaway subsidiary vehicle I flagged this morning." He looked up. "Give me 4 hours." Brielle was looking at Mason. He was looking at the phone. "He's scared," Mason said. "Owen gets scared in the dark. He sleeps with the light on." He stopped. "He thinks I'm coming." "You are coming," Brielle said. "Brielle." He looked at her. "I can't ask you to." "You didn't ask." She was already standing, reaching for her crutches. "I'm not retracting anything. I'm not destroying anything. And I am not letting them use a 7-year-old boy to make me do it." Something in her face had gone very quiet and very clear, the way the air goes before a weather change. "What do we need?" Ray was already on his phone. Mason looked at the drive sitting on the kitchen table, the thing they'd been protecting for days, the thing everything had orbited around. He looked at it for a second, then he picked it up and put it in his pocket. "Tell me about the warehouse," he said to Ray. Ray pulled up the satellite image on his tablet. A rectangular structure, maybe 8,000 square feet, set back from a secondary road in an industrial area east of town. Loading dock on the north face, single pedestrian entrance on the south, 2 cameras visible on the exterior corners, a chain-link perimeter with 1 vehicle gate. 2 ways in, Ray said. The vehicle gate, which they'll be watching, and a gap in the perimeter fence on the east side that I can see in the satellite imagery. They may not have found it, or they may not consider it a risk. He paused. They're not professionals. They're corporate security-adjacent people who've been asked to do something outside their usual scope. That's not an advantage to be wasted. What's your plan? Brielle said. My plan has 3 parts, and it requires all of us to do exactly what I say when I say it. He looked between them. You two are not operators. I need you to understand that and accept it. We understand it, Mason said. Do you? Mason looked at him. My son is in that building, he said. Tell me what to do. Ray told them. The next 4 hours were the longest of Mason's life, and they were also, in some way he couldn't fully account for, the clearest. There was no room for anything except the next step. Ray made 3 more calls, established that a state police unit had been quietly briefed and was staged half a mile from the warehouse, not close enough to trigger the kidnappers, close enough to respond. He confirmed the vehicle inside. He confirmed through a contact that the 2 men who'd driven Owen there were the same 2 men from the gray Charger, that they were not armed with anything beyond handguns, and that there was a 3rd man, the one who'd made the call, who was somewhere else entirely and would be someone else's problem. Brielle sat across from Mason at the kitchen table while they waited for Ray's signal. She didn't try to fill the silence with reassurance, and he didn't want her to. He looked at his hands. When this is over, he said, I'm putting up the tire swing. She looked at him. Yeah? Owen's right. The branch is fine. He paused. I've been making him wait long enough. She was quiet for a moment. He sounds like a good kid. He's the best person I know, Mason said, without any performance in it, just the plain, worn truth of it. He's been patient with me about a lot of things. Brielle didn't answer that, but she reached across the table and put her hand over his, and this time she left it there. Ray's phone buzzed at 9:47 in the evening. We move, he said. Mason was on his feet before the second word was out. The warehouse was dark on the outside and lit from within, the kind of building that had high, small windows that cast light upward rather than out, so from the road it looked almost unoccupied. Ray went through the fence gap first, silent in a way that Mason tried to replicate and approximately managed. Brielle stayed at the car with the phone, Ray's instruction, and she'd accepted it without argument, which told Mason she understood exactly how serious this was. The south door was padlocked from the outside, which told Ray something. He moved to the east face, found a ventilation access panel, and had it open in under 2 minutes using tools from his vest that Mason didn't ask the names of. Inside was the smell of old machinery and concrete dust, and the specific quiet of a building that was being used as something it wasn't designed for. Light at the far end, the warm yellow of work lights. Voices, low, not alarmed. The voices of men who were waiting and not expecting interruption. Owen's voice. Small, tired, but present. I want to go home. And one of the men, not unkindly but not gently either. Sit down, kid. Mason heard his son's voice and his body made a decision before his brain was involved. Ray's hand on his shoulder was the only thing that kept him from moving immediately, and he felt the pressure of it, firm, deliberate, and made himself stop. Ray held up 2 fingers. 2 men visible. He pointed to himself, then left. He pointed to Mason, then right. Then he held up 3 fingers and began counting down. Mason went right on 1. What followed was not clean and not quiet and not anything like the way those moments looked in movies. There was shouting, there was the sound of something heavy hitting the concrete floor, there was a man who tried to get between Mason and the back of the warehouse, and who found that Mason was moving with the particular focused momentum of a person who was not going to be stopped, and who went sideways when Mason hit him with a shoulder that had been built by 12 years of physical labor. Owen was in the back corner, sitting on an overturned crate, his knees pulled up to his chest and his red hoodie still on, his eyes enormous in the work light. When he saw Mason come around the row of shelving units, he came off the crate so fast he nearly fell. Mason caught him. He got down on one knee and pulled Owen in with both arms, and Owen made a sound against his shoulder that broke something loose in Mason's chest that he hadn't known was held that tight. He could feel his son shaking, the full-body tremor of a child who had been holding himself very still and very scared for several hours, and had just been given permission to stop. "I've got you," Mason said. "I've got you. I've got you." "I knew you were coming," Owen said, muffled against his shoulder. Yeah, Mason said. His voice was not entirely steady. Yeah, I know you did. Outside, the state police units were already moving through the gate. The two men from the warehouse were in state police custody before midnight. Their names were Dennis Hurl and Craig Ferris, corporate security contractors who had, at some point in the previous year, crossed a line they probably hadn't fully understood they were crossing when they crossed it. By the time Mason was loading Owen into his truck in the warehouse parking lot, both men were already talking, which Ray told him later was what happened when people who were not actually criminals got arrested for something that carried federal kidnapping charges and realized very quickly that the person who'd hired them was not going to absorb any of the consequences on their behalf. Owen fell asleep in the truck on the way home. He'd been awake for most of the time they'd held him. He told Mason this in fragments over the following days, filling in the picture gradually, the way kids did, a detail here and a detail there rather than all at once. And the exhaustion took him down fast, his head against the window, his red hoodie still zipped to his chin. Mason drove with one hand on the wheel and one eye on Owen and didn't trust himself to say much of anything. Brielle was still at the house when they got back. She'd been told by phone what had happened. Ray had called her the moment Owen was clear. But she was on the front step anyway, and when Mason carried Owen in from the truck, she stood aside and held the door and didn't say anything. He got Owen upstairs and into bed without fully waking him, got his shoes off and pulled the blanket up, turned on the small lamp on the nightstand that Owen had picked out himself at a garage sale 2 years ago. It had a blue shade, and Owen called it the ocean light, which was inexplicable, given that he'd never seen the ocean. Mason stood in the doorway of Owen's room for a long time. Then he went downstairs. Brielle was at the kitchen table with 2 cups of tea, which struck him as an odd and specific choice. Neither of them had been drinking tea. And then he saw that she'd been looking through the cabinets for something to do with her hands, and tea was what she'd found. She pushed 1 cup toward him when he sat down. "He's okay?" she said. "He's asleep." Mason wrapped both hands around the cup. The tea was slightly too hot and slightly too strong, and he drank it anyway. "He'll be okay. He's tougher than I give him credit for." "He told them he knew you were coming. You talked to him?" "For about 3 minutes while you were carrying him in. He wanted to tell someone." She looked at the cup in her hands. "He said he kept thinking about the fire. That you ran into the fire for a stranger, and so he knew you'd definitely come for him." Mason didn't say anything for a moment. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog was barking at something and then stopped. "He knew about the fire?" Mason said. "Someone at school told him, or he overheard something. He didn't say exactly." She paused. "He said, and I'm quoting directly, that his dad was pretty much unkillable. He seemed very confident about this." Mason put the cup down and pressed one hand over his face and stayed like that for a few seconds. It was not quite crying and not quite laughing, that particular overwrought moment when the body doesn't know which direction to go and settles for neither. When he took his hand away, Brielle was watching him with the expression she got when she was being careful with him, which was a different face than the one she used for everything else. "The kidnapping is a federal charge," she said, moving them to stable ground, which he understood she was doing on purpose and was grateful for. "Ray says Hurl and Ferris are talking. Their cooperation agreement, if the DA offers one, will require them to provide testimony about who contracted them." Caldwell. "Almost certainly through another intermediary, but the chain is short enough. He's been doing everything through short chains, 2 removes at most, because he thought the land fraud was impenetrable. Once you're looking at him for the land fraud, the chain compresses fast." She had her phone on the table and was looking at something on the screen. "The state AG announced a full investigation this morning. I have a call with my contact there tomorrow. Evan has been in contact with a federal environmental crimes unit that's been monitoring Callaway Group for an unrelated matter and is now very interested in the documentation we provided." "How long before Caldwell is arrested?" "Weeks, maybe. Possibly less. The land fraud plus the kidnapping plus whatever the feds have been building separately." She put the phone down. "He's not running anywhere. He's 61 years old. His company's share price dropped 18% today. 3 of his board members have already issued statements distancing themselves, and he's publicly silent, which means his lawyers have told him to stay that way." Something in her voice was flat and tired in a way that was different from her normal flatness. He thought he could burn a canyon and buy himself another few years. He was wrong. Mason looked at her. In the kitchen light, with the stitches on her brow still visible, and her ankle propped on the chair beside her, and the accumulated weight of the past week sitting visibly on her shoulders, she looked like someone who had been in a long fight and knew it wasn't quite over yet, and was tired in the bone-deep way of someone who had not let themselves feel that until it was almost safe to. "When did you eat last?" he said. She blinked. "I had something." "When?" She thought about it. "Lunch." "It's 11:30. He got up. "Mason, you don't have to." "I know I don't have to." He opened the refrigerator. The available materials were limited. He hadn't been grocery shopping in 4 days, for obvious reasons. But there was eggs, half a block of sharp cheddar, the end of a sourdough loaf that was still good. "Eggs okay?" She looked at him from across the kitchen with the expression of someone who was not used to people making them food and wasn't entirely sure how to receive it. "Eggs are fine," she said. He made eggs. She ate them. They didn't talk much, and the silence was the comfortable kind, which surprised him a little. He hadn't had that kind of silence with another person in a long time. The kind where you didn't feel obligated to fill it. When she put the fork down, she said, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For involving you in something that put Owen at risk." She said it directly, meeting his eyes. "I told you it was dangerous. I told you they wouldn't stop. But I let you help me anyway, and Owen paid for that. Owen is home safe." "By a margin," she said, "by a smaller margin than I'm comfortable with." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't force me into anything. I chose to be involved." "I know. I'd make the same choice again." She looked at him. "Even now?" "With what it cost." He thought about Owen in the truck, asleep with his chin on his chest. He thought about Owen saying his dad was unkillable. He thought about what it would have cost to walk away at the highway junction when he dropped Brielle at the motel, to have driven home and made pasta and gone to sleep and read about the wildfire in the morning news like everyone else. "Yeah," he said, "even now." Brielle held his gaze for a long time. Then she looked away, out the kitchen window at the dark backyard, and he could see her working through something. Not an argument, but something internal, something that took a moment. "I'm not easy," she said. "I told you that at the beginning." "You did." "I mean it in ways that go beyond the investigation. I work too much. I have a hard time trusting people. I get focused on something and I lose track of everything else." She said it like she was filing a disclosure, getting it on the record. "I've been told those are significant problems." "By who?" "Two ex-partners who were both right about it." She said it without self-pity. "I'm aware of my own patterns. That doesn't mean I've fixed them." He looked at her. "Are you telling me this because you think I need to know? Or because you're looking for a reason to back away from something?" She met his eyes. That directness again, that complete absence of deflection. "I don't know yet," she said, which was, he thought, probably the most honest thing she could have said. "That's okay," he said. "I don't know either." He picked up her plate and his and took them to the sink. "You should stay tonight. The couch pulls out and it's actually comfortable." Owen picked it based on couch sleeping criteria, which are different from regular sleeping criteria but serve a specific purpose. She laughed at that. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, unexpected enough that it seemed to surprise her slightly. "Couch sleeping criteria," she said. "Firmness, pull-out mechanism ease, proximity to the kitchen." His words, not mine. He sounds like a very practical 7-year-old. He gets it from his mother. He turned off the kitchen light. "I'll get you the extra blanket." Victor Caldwell was arrested on a Wednesday morning, 31 days after the story broke. Mason heard about it the way most people did. A push notification from a news app. 3 words. Caldwell arrested. Charged. He was on a job site at the time, 40 feet up a scaffold on a commercial project east of town. And he read it twice and then put his phone in his pocket and went back to work because there was nothing else to do in that moment. And standing on a scaffold was not the moment for any kind of reaction. He called Brielle on his lunch break. She answered on the first ring. I saw it, she said. How do you feel? A pause. I don't know yet. Ask me in a week. The county commissioners? Holt has already resigned. Deering is holding on, but his attorney filed something this morning that suggests he's negotiating. She was somewhere with ambient noise, her office, he thought. She'd been going back to the office for the past week, navigating on a crutch with the ankle still in its boot. The environmental falsification charges are being handled separately by the federal unit. That's going to take longer. But it's happening. It's happening. She said it quietly, without triumph, just the weight of something real. The Meridian parcels are frozen pending investigation. The development project is dead. The watershed is... She stopped. The watershed is going to be okay. He ate his sandwich and looked out across the job site. The raw structure of the building rising in front of him, the exposed framing that would become walls and rooms and a place where people worked, all of it currently skeleton and open air. Dinner tonight, he said. I'll cook something that isn't eggs. A brief pause. Owen will be there? He wants to teach you to play Uno. He's been talking about it for 3 days. He knows I'm coming to dinner? I told him yesterday. He started planning immediately. Another pause, warmer than the first. Tell him I should warn him that I'm not bad at Uno. He'll take that as a challenge. Good, she said. Tell him it should be a challenge. Bob. He put the tire swing up on a Saturday, 6 weeks after the kidnapping, with a neighbor's help and Owen directing from the ground with the authority of a small person who had been right about something for a long time and knew it. The branch held fine, was in fact exactly as good as Owen had always maintained. Brielle sat in a lawn chair in the yard with her ankle finally out of the boot, watching the installation with the focused attention she brought to things she found genuinely interesting. He was right about the branch, she said to Mason when he came down from the ladder. Don't tell him that. He already knows. Owen tested the swing with the complete commitment of someone who had zero interest in testing it cautiously, launching himself into it full speed and swinging out over the yard with his head thrown back and his eyes closed. Mason watched him with one hand still on the ladder and felt the particular thing you feel when a good thing happens that has been a long time coming. Brielle came to stand beside him. She'd traded the crutches for a cane last week. She hated the cane but used it, which was about as much as anyone could ask. She stood close enough that he could feel the warmth of her arm against his. You okay? She said, and he understood that she was asking about more than the tire swing. Yeah, he said. I think I am. Owen swung back toward them, dragging his feet to slow himself, and looked at Brielle. You should try it. My ankle. Dad can hold it still, so you just sit in it. You don't have to swing. She looked at Mason. He was already trying not to smile. You don't have to, he said. I know I don't have to. She handed him the cane, which was the answer. He held the rope steady, and she settled into the tire with the careful dignity of someone doing something undignified entirely on purpose. And when she was in it, she looked at Owen and said, Give me a push. Owen pushed her. She swung out over the yard in a single, smooth arc, her hair lifting, and she laughed. The same real laugh that had surprised her in the kitchen that first night, but longer this time, fuller, like something that had found more room. Mason watched her, and something in him that had been held at a careful distance for 3 years moved closer without being asked to. Owen watched Brielle swing and then looked at his dad with the particular expression of a 7-year-old who was paying more attention than adults generally gave him credit for. I like her, he said. I know you do, Mason said. Do you like her? He watched her swing come back, watched her reach for the rope to slow it, watched her look at him from the tire with those sharp, dark eyes and that half smile she'd been practicing more often lately. Yeah, he said. I really do. Owen considered this with great seriousness. You should probably tell her. I probably should, Mason agreed. Owen nodded, satisfied, and went to pull the swing back for another push. The federal environmental crimes indictment against Callaway Group landed 8 weeks after Caldwell's arrest, and it was larger than anyone had publicly predicted. 17 counts spanning 11 years, encompassing the land fraud, the falsified environmental assessments, the bribery, and a financial structure that federal prosecutors described as one of the more sophisticated money laundering operations they'd encountered in the environmental crime space. 4 additional executives were named. 2 law firms that had facilitated the shell company registrations were under investigation. The county official who had transferred the records clerk to another department was formally removed. Evan Cross wrote a follow-up piece. He quoted Brielle at length, and he quoted Mason briefly, a single line about hearing a voice in the canyon and making a choice. And he ended the piece with a note about the Alpine Canyon watershed, which the state had formally moved to place under protected status pending the resolution of the legal proceedings. Brielle read the piece on Mason's couch on a Sunday morning with Owen asleep upstairs and coffee going in the kitchen and the oak tree visible through the window, casting its slow September shadow across the yard. He got the shell company structure slightly wrong in the 3rd paragraph, she said. Is it importantly wrong? Not importantly. She kept reading. He's a good writer. I noticed. She finished the piece and set the laptop aside and looked at the oak tree and the tire swing hanging still in the morning air. She had the expression she got when she was thinking about something real, not working, just thinking. I'm going back to work full-time starting Monday, she said. The company has been patient, but there are 3 projects that need me in person, and I've been working around it long enough. I know. I'll be in the city more than I'm here. I know that too. She looked at him. This thing between us is not going anywhere, he said, which was not what she'd expected him to say, based on her expression. You don't know what I was going to say. You were going to say something careful about distance and logistics, and how we shouldn't make assumptions about what this is. He looked at her. I've known you for almost 3 months. I know how you frame things when you're scared of them. She was quiet for a moment. I'm not scared of many things. I know, that's how I know you're scared of this one. She held his gaze. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, the kind that made everything look slightly more significant than it was, or possibly exactly as significant as it was. I'm not going to be easy, she said, which was what she always said when she meant something else. Brielle. What? I know. He said it simply. I'm not asking for easy. I'm asking for you. She looked at him for a long time. The oak tree moved in whatever wind was moving through the yard. Upstairs, Owen shifted in his sleep. They could hear it through the old house's floors, that particular creak. Okay, she said. It was a small word for what it meant, but she said it like she meant the whole thing. He reached over and took her hand and she let him, and they sat like that in the Sunday morning quiet, with the coffee going and Owen sleeping and the canyon somewhere to the south slowly greening over its burned places, new growth already pushing through the ash in the way that land had always done, persistent and indifferent to what had been done to it, returning regardless. The empire Caldwell had built on fraud and stolen ground was coming down piece by piece, charge by charge, the whole elaborate structure collapsing under the weight of what it had always actually been, a lie built on other lies, held up by money and fear and the willingness of certain people to look away. And in a small house in Ridgeline, 2 people who had found each other in the worst possible circumstances sat quietly in the morning and let the day come, and that was enough. The trials took the better part of 14 months. That was the thing nobody told you about justice. How long it actually took, how unglamorous the machinery of it was, how much of it happened in fluorescent-lit courtrooms with bad carpet and procedural language that turned human wrongdoing into something that sounded almost administrative. Mason sat through 4 days of testimony spread across 2 different hearings, gave his account of the fire and the creek bed and the sound of Brielle's voice coming up through the smoke, and each time he finished and stepped down from the stand, he felt the particular flatness of someone who has told a true story and watched it get processed into evidence. Brielle testified for 3 days in the federal proceeding and 1 day in the state environmental case. She was, by every account, a precise and devastating witness, not emotional, not theatrical, just relentlessly accurate in a way that made cross-examination difficult because there was nothing to grip, no overstatement to walk back, no moment where she'd said more than she could prove. Her attorney told her afterward that she'd been the best witness he'd seen in 20 years of practice. She said thank you and asked what was next. That was Brielle. Even in the moments that should have felt like victories, she was already looking at what came after. Victor Caldwell was convicted on 11 of the 17 federal counts: fraud, conspiracy, bribery, money laundering, and environmental crimes, and sentenced to 16 years. He was 62 years old at sentencing, and his attorney argued his age and his decades of business contributions and his philanthropic record, and the judge listened to all of it and gave him 16 years anyway, because the scale of what he'd done was the kind of thing that didn't get discounted for good behavior in other areas of a man's life. Mason watched the sentencing on a live stream from Brielle's office in the city, sitting on the small couch she kept near the window with Owen beside him, because Owen had asked to see it, and Mason had decided that a 7-year-old, 8 now, as of April, who had been held in a warehouse as part of the story, had earned the right to watch its ending. Owen watched Caldwell stand for the sentence with the focused attention he brought to things he was trying to understand, and when it was over, he looked at his father and said, "Is he going to be in jail until he dies?" "Maybe," Mason said. "Depends on a lot of things." Owen considered this. "Good," he said, which was not a complicated moral position, and Mason didn't try to complicate it for him. Some things, at 8 years old, could just be what they were. Commissioner Holt had pleaded guilty 4 months earlier and received 30 months and a lifetime ban from public office. Commissioner Deering, who had held on the longest and fought the hardest, ultimately got 4 years when the jury came back with a verdict on all counts. The law firm partners who'd registered the shell companies received suspended sentences and disbarment proceedings that would likely take another year to finalize. 2 of Caldwell's co-executives at Callaway Group cooperated and received reduced sentences. The third did not cooperate and received the longest sentence of anyone in the proceeding after Caldwell himself. The records clerk who'd been transferred for flagging an inconsistency, a woman named Paula Reyes, who had spent 3 years in a different department doing work she hadn't trained for, was formally reinstated to the Land Records Office with back pay covering the period of her wrongful transfer. She came to the civil proceeding to testify about what she'd found, and she was so clearly, quietly furious about 3 years of her professional life being taken from her that the courtroom went still when she spoke. Brielle had made sure Paula Reyes' name was in Evan's original story. She had not forgotten about her. The Meridian parcels, all 19 of them, plus 6 additional properties identified during the federal investigation, were transferred to state custody pending disposition. The illegal development project's infrastructure, such as it was, had never advanced beyond planning documents and preliminary grading on 2 parcels. The grading was remediated. The planning documents became exhibits. The Alpine Canyon watershed was formally designated a protected conservation area on a Thursday in late November, 14 months after the fire. Brielle signed the supporting documentation as a public advocate for the designation. Mason was there, standing in the back of a small room in the State Environmental Agency's regional office, holding Owen's hand because Owen had insisted on coming, and Mason had learned to stop arguing with Owen about things that mattered. When it was done, when the pen went down and the designation was official, and the small cluster of environmentalists and agency staff in the room started to breathe again, Brielle looked across the room at Mason. He gave her a nod. She gave him one back. It was not a dramatic moment. It was a Thursday afternoon in a government office with bad lighting and a folding table with a coffee urn that had been on since morning. But it was real, and it was finished. And after 14 months of process and testimony and procedural delays and appeals and the long, grinding work of consequences actually catching up to people who had believed they were beyond them, it was done. Owen tugged Mason's hand on the way out. "Is that it?" he said. "That's it," Mason said. "So the canyon is safe now?" "Yeah, the canyon is safe." Owen thought about this for half a block. "Can we go hiking there when it's better?" "When it's better," Mason said. "Yeah, we can." The canyon did get better, not fast. Land doesn't heal fast. Whatever people like to say about nature's resilience, what actually happened was slower and stranger than resilience. The burned section stayed black for a long time, long past when they should have looked different, long past when Mason had expected some visible sign of recovery. Then, in the second spring after the fire, he drove out to the lower trail with Owen and Brielle on a Saturday in March. and the new growth was everywhere. Not just scattered, not tentative, but a full low carpet of green coming up through the ash-pale soil, native grasses and chaparral, and the first small gray-green rosettes of plants that would, in another few years, be shrubs. The burned Jeffrey pines were still standing, most of them, those black columns, but some had put out new growth from their bases, small and improbable, the needles a bright, almost aggressive green against the char. Owen ran ahead on his trail in the way he always did, and then stopped and crouched down to look at something close to the ground. Mason and Brielle came up beside him. "What is it?" Mason said. "A lizard," Owen said. "It's just sitting there." It was a small western fence lizard on a flat rock, doing the push-up display they did for territory or warmth, entirely unbothered by 3 humans standing over it. Its scales caught the March light. "The canyon had lizards before the fire," Brielle said. "I know," Owen said. "They came back." She looked at Mason over Owen's head. He looked back. There were things that came back. That was what the canyon was teaching, slowly, over years. Not that destruction didn't happen, not that it left no mark, but that the mark was not the last word. The burned trees were still there, and they were also putting out new needles. Both things were true at the same time. The canyon held the fire and the recovery simultaneously, without choosing between them. And maybe that was the closest thing to wisdom the landscape had to offer, that you didn't have to resolve the contradiction. You just had to keep going until the green came up through the ash. Mason had thought about Claire a lot during the 14 months of the trial. Not in the sharp, chest-clutching way of the first year after she'd died, but in the quieter way that grief settles into when it becomes part of the background of a life, rather than its foreground. He thought about what she would have made of all of it. The fire, Brielle, Owen in the warehouse, the whole accumulation of events that had started when he'd heard a voice he couldn't ignore. He thought she would have had opinions. She always had opinions. She would have liked Brielle immediately, and said so directly, and probably embarrassed everyone involved. He thought she would have understood why he'd gone back into the canyon that day. She'd always understood that impulse in him better than he did. That reflexive turn toward the thing that needed doing, the inability to keep walking when there was a voice in the smoke. She'd called it his best quality and also, occasionally, the most exhausting thing about him. And she'd been right on both counts. He didn't tell Brielle all of this, not at once, not in any organized way. He told her pieces of it over months, the way you tell someone pieces of a life. Not as a presentation, but as evidence that accumulates slowly into something like real knowledge of another person. She listened the way she did everything, with her full attention and without performing emotion she didn't feel, which meant when she did respond, it was real. Once, late at night in her apartment in the city, she'd kept it after the break-in, had the locks replaced and the door reinforced, and refused to be displaced from her own home by people who no longer had any power over her. She asked him if he felt guilty about loving her. He'd thought about the question seriously. "No," he said. "I thought I would. For a long time I thought that would be the thing that stopped me." "What stopped it stopping you?" "Owen," he said. "He started talking about you like you were just part of things. Not in a big way. He didn't make a speech about it. He just started counting you in, setting a place at the table without being asked, factoring you into his plans." He paused. "He's 8. He's practical. He wasn't going to let me make it complicated." Brielle looked at the ceiling. "He's smarter than both of us." "Considerably," Mason agreed. She turned her head on the pillow to look at him. "I've been thinking about the heart renewable expansion." "Right now?" "I'm always thinking about it. It's not a reflection on the moment." She said it dryly. "We're looking at a regional office, either here or Ridgeline." He was quiet. "Ridgeline. That's what I was thinking. Is that because of work reasons or—" "Both," she said. "Legitimately both. The regional infrastructure in that corridor is genuinely better for what we need. And also—" She stopped. "Also," he said. "Also it would mean less time in the car between here and there." She said it the way she said things when she'd been thinking about them for a while and had decided they were true, with that particular flatness that was not distance but its opposite, the sound of something that had been decided. He said nothing for a moment. Then, Owen is going to be insufferable about this. I know. He's going to think it's because of him. It's partially because of him. He's going to want to tell everyone. He can tell everyone, she said. I don't mind. They got engaged on a Sunday in October, 2 years after the fire. It was not an elaborate moment. It was not planned in any coordinated way. There was no restaurant, no ring hidden in a dessert, nothing that required advance arrangements. It was an ordinary Sunday morning in Mason's kitchen in Ridgeline. Owen at a sleepover at a friend's house for the first time. The house quiet in the particular way it was only when Owen was genuinely gone. Brielle was reading something on her laptop at the table. Mason was making coffee. He'd been carrying the ring for 3 weeks, which he recognized was a slightly absurd amount of time to carry something without doing anything with it. He'd bought it without agonizing. He'd had an idea of what she'd want, something simple and not ostentatious. And he'd been right. And the jeweler had said it was a good choice, and then he'd put it in his jacket pocket and kept not finding the right moment, which he eventually understood was because he was looking for a moment that felt like a production, and she was not a person who wanted a production. He put the coffee down in front of her. She looked up. He took the ring box out of his pocket and set it on the table beside the coffee. She looked at the box, then at him. Brielle, he said, I'm not going to make a speech. Good, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. He stopped. Started again. You came back to the canyon for the evidence because it mattered. You wouldn't retract the story even when they took Owen. You sat in a government office for 3 days and testified to everything, and you didn't soften a single thing because someone was uncomfortable. He looked at her. I want to be the person sitting next to you for the rest of that, whatever that looks like. She looked at the ring box for a long moment. Her hands were flat on the table. Open it, he said. She opened it. The ring was what he'd thought. Simple, white gold, a single stone that was not trying too hard to be anything other than what it was. She picked it up, held it. Yes, she said. Not tearfully, not with drama, just yes, clear and complete, the way she said things she meant. He let out a breath he'd apparently been holding for 3 weeks. She put the ring on her own finger, which was exactly what he'd expected her to do, and looked at it, and then she looked at him. You carried that in your pocket for a long time, she said. I was waiting for the right moment. This is a regular Sunday morning. Yeah, he said. That's what I finally figured out. She stood up and came around the table and put both arms around him, which she didn't do often and which he understood for exactly what it was. Not a gesture she performed casually, but one she meant entirely. He held her back. They stood in the kitchen for a while. The coffee got cold. Owen came home from the sleepover at noon, dropped his bag inside the door with the particular violence of a child who has been awake until 2 a.m. and is now running on something other than sleep, and immediately noticed that something was different because Owen always noticed. He looked at Brielle's hand. He looked at Mason. He looked at Brielle's hand again. Is that? He started. Yes, Brielle said. Owen sat down on the floor, not dramatically, just sat down, cross-legged, right there in the entryway, like his legs had stopped taking instructions. You're going to get married, he said. That's the plan, Mason said. Owen looked at the floor for a moment. Then he looked up, and his face had that complicated expression that children get when something they've been wanting for a long time has actually happened, and they're not sure whether to be happy about it or terrified by the realness of it. Does that mean Brielle lives here? He said. If that's okay with you, Brielle said. Owen thought about it. This was what Mason loved, and occasionally was exhausted by Owen's insistence on actually thinking about things, not just reacting. You travel a lot, Owen said finally. I do, Brielle said. That's true. But you'd come back. Every time. Another pause. You're not great at Uno, he said. I just want you to know I'm not going to go easy on you just because you live here. Brielle kept her face very straight. I wouldn't expect you to. Owen nodded, then he got up off the floor and crossed the room and hugged her around the middle with the sudden, total commitment of a child who had made a decision and was acting on it. And Brielle, who was not in general a person who cried in front of people, pressed her lips together, and held him back and blinked at the ceiling for a moment. Mason watched from the doorway. He didn't say anything. Some moments were not improved by commentary. They married the following June, in the canyon. The lower meadow had recovered enough by then that the grass was knee-high in places. The native wildflowers coming back in wide, low spreads of yellow and purple that nobody had planted, that had simply returned because they'd been there before, and seeds were patient. The burned trees were still visible on the slopes above. They would be visible for years, possibly decades. But the meadow itself was alive and green and smelled like hot grass and sage in the afternoon sun. Brielle had not wanted a large wedding, and Mason had not wanted a large wedding, and the one concession to scale was that both of them had more people who mattered to them than they'd initially accounted for. Evan Cross came, looking slightly less sleep-deprived than usual, and shook Mason's hand and told Brielle she was the best source he'd ever had, and she told him that was an odd thing to say at a wedding, and he said fair enough. Ray Pacheco came, stood in the back, left before the reception began, which was exactly what Mason had expected from him. Paula Reyes came, at Brielle's specific invitation, and stood near the front with her family and cried in the good way. Owen stood beside his father during the ceremony, wearing a suit he'd had opinions about and which had been modified accordingly. No tie, collar open, which he'd argued was more practical and which nobody had seriously contested. He held the rings when it was time to hold the rings, and he held them with the gravity of someone who understood their symbolic weight, which he did, because he was Owen and he paid attention to things. There was no officiant who talked about destiny or fate. The person who married them was a family court judge who was also an old friend of Brielle's and who had a dry, precise manner that suited both of them. She said the words that needed to be said, and Mason and Brielle said what they'd written themselves. Not long, not elaborate, not the kind of vows that made people cry because of their beauty, but the kind that made people sit forward slightly because they felt true. Mason said, "I heard you in the smoke and I came back. I want to keep doing that, whatever that looks like every time, for as long as I've got." Brielle said, "I spent 14 months trying to protect something that mattered. I want to spend the rest of my life doing that, and you and Owen are the most important part of what matters. I'm not easy, you know that, but I'm here, and I'm going to stay here, and I'll try to be worth the choosing." Owen, who was not supposed to speak, said, very quietly but audibly enough, "She is worth it, by the way." Laughter moved through the assembled people, genuine and warm, and even the judge smiled, which she probably wasn't supposed to do. Mason looked at his son and then at the woman beside him and thought, this is what it looks like when a life rebuilds itself. Not cleanly, not without loss, not without the visible evidence of everything that burned before the new growth came. The black trees still on the slope, the ache of Claire's absence that he would carry always, Owen's memory of a warehouse and a dark night that would be part of him long after he'd made peace with it. All of it present, all of it real, held inside the same afternoon as the wildflowers and the grass, and the people who had come because they wanted to be here. He said "I do" with his son standing beside him, and the canyon around him, and 14 months of a long fight, finally behind them. In the years that followed, Alpine Canyon became something else entirely from what Victor Caldwell had intended for it. The conservation designation held. The legal challenges from the Callaway Group's remaining subsidiaries, 2 of them tried, in the way that corporate legal machinery tries things even when the cases are weak, failed. The watershed remained intact. Environmental biologists began a study of the post-fire recovery that was still ongoing several years later, and their findings about the speed of certain species' return to burned habitats became a reasonably cited paper in regional ecology circles, which Brielle read and found genuinely interesting and which Mason read 2 pages of before putting down, which was honest. Hart Renewable Systems opened its regional office in Ridgeline in the spring following the wedding. Brielle ran both operations, city headquarters and regional office, with the focused, slightly exhausting energy that was simply how she was built. And she got better over time at the parts of running something that she'd always been less natural at, letting other people carry weight, trusting her team with things she would have handled herself before, coming home at a reasonable hour more often than not. She didn't get perfect at these things. She got better. Owen grew. He was 10, then 11, then 12, and each year he was different in ways that surprised Mason, even when he'd been paying attention. At 10, he was still interested in rocks. At 11, he developed a consuming interest in how satellites worked, which led Mason down a rabbit hole of YouTube explainers that he had mixed feelings about. At 12, he started asking questions about the trial. Not just what had happened, but why people did what they did, the mechanics of wrongdoing, how someone like Caldwell had spent a decade building something fraudulent and convinced himself, apparently, that it was sustainable. Mason tried to answer those questions honestly, which was harder than he expected. He thought he was beyond the consequences, Mason said once, driving Owen home from school on a Tuesday, the ordinary kind of Tuesday the day hadn't been when this all started. Did he know what he was doing was wrong? Owen said. I think he knew and had decided that knowing didn't matter. Owen looked out the window. That's worse than not knowing. Yeah, Mason said, it is. Brielle knew it was wrong too, Owen said, but she went the other direction. She did. Why do some people go that direction and some people go the other one? Mason had thought about this, had thought about it in various forms since the morning he'd stood on a fire road and heard a voice in the smoke and turned around. He'd thought about it when he sat in the courthouse watching Caldwell stand for sentence. He'd thought about it looking at Owen in that warehouse, in the work light, still in his red hoodie and thinking, what kind of man do I want my son to see me be? I don't think it's one decision, he said. I think it's a lot of small decisions that add up. And at some point, the direction you've been going is just the direction you're going, and it gets harder to turn around. Owen considered this with the serious expression he'd been refining for 12 years. So you have to turn around early, he said. Or keep turning around, Mason said, every time you notice you're going the wrong way. Owen nodded slowly, like he was filing this somewhere. They drove the rest of the way home in the comfortable silence that had always, since Owen was very small, been possible between them. Mason thought about what his son was growing into. Not what he would become, which was unknowable, but what he already was. Someone who asked real questions and sat with the answers and didn't look for the version that was easier than the truth. He had Claire's instinct for that, the willingness to look at things directly. He'd carry it in different ways, make different choices, build a different life. But the instinct was there. That was enough. That was more than enough. On the 3rd anniversary of the wildfire, Mason drove out to Alpine Canyon in the morning before anyone else was up. He did this alone, not as a ritual exactly, but as a habit that had formed without being planned, a quiet hour in the early light before the day got going. The lower trail was fully recovered now. You had to know where to look to see the evidence of the fire, the ghost shapes of burned root systems in the soil, the unusually open patches where a dense stand of pines had stood and didn't anymore. But the grass was thick, and the chaparral was shoulder high, and the creek bed, which had been dry the day he'd carried Brielle through it, had run 2 winters in a row, which the hydrologists attributed to the improved watershed retention now that the land was protected. He walked to the boulder where he'd found her. It looked different without the smoke and the fire-orange light. Just a rock? Granite? Larger than it needed to be. The kind that existed in canyons simply because rock existed in canyons. The dry creek bed was dry again today. It ran seasonally, not constantly, and the meadow beyond it was moving slightly in the morning air. He stood there for a while. He thought about the moment before he'd heard her. The moment on the fire road, keys in hand, the right direction clearly established, the truck running, and Owen waiting and every sensible instinct pointing away from the smoke. He thought about how close that was. How easily a person could keep walking. How the difference between the life he had and some other life came down to 4 seconds on a fire road and a sound he couldn't ignore. He didn't think of himself as a brave person particularly. He thought of himself as someone who had, on a specific afternoon, been unable to do the easier thing. That was different from bravery. Bravery implied a choice made against fear. What he'd felt on that fire road hadn't been fearlessness. It had been something more like compulsion, the simple inability to keep going when there was a reason to stop. But maybe that was what courage actually was, most of the time. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that got narrated in stories, but the ordinary kind that happened when someone was unable to leave a thing undone and turned around before they'd thought it through. He'd turned around, and the rest had followed. The rest included Brielle, who was home right now, probably already working, her laptop open before 7. The regional office reports she reviewed on the first of every month open in 3 tabs. The rest included Owen, asleep in his room under a poster of the solar system that he'd tacked up himself, and that was slightly crooked and that Mason had not corrected because Owen had put it there and it was his room. The rest included a tire swing in the backyard, and a canyon designated forever as protected land, and a drive on a kitchen shelf that they'd kept, for reasons that were more symbolic than practical, as a reminder that some things were worth the keeping. The rest included a life that had rebuilt itself from its own burned places into something that was not the same as what had come before and was not trying to be. Just its own thing, imperfect and ongoing and real. He stood in the meadow until the sun was fully up and the lizards were out on the flat rocks, and somewhere above him a red-tailed hawk was doing long, slow circles on the morning thermals, and then he turned and walked back up the trail toward the truck. He had a tire swing to push a 12-year-old on, and a wife who would tease him for being sentimental about early morning walks in canyons, and coffee to make before anyone woke up. The ordinary things. The things that waited. The things that, if you were paying attention, turned out to be the whole of it. He drove home with the windows down and the canyon in his rearview mirror, green and scarred and alive, still becoming whatever it was going to be, just like everyone in it.